As usual.
Okay. So, good evening, folks, and welcome to, I'll use my teacher voice. Good evening, folks, and welcome to the second of our Alba Party Equalities Roadshows. My name's Heather McLean, and I'm proud to be a founding member of the Alba Party and part of the Equalities convener, Eva Comray's Equalities team. We are planning to take these roadshows all over Scotland with the intention of reaching out to ordinary people, getting them signed up to the electoral register and recognise the power they have in their hands by voting. We are here to highlight the injustice of poverty and speak about how we can change things through independence for Scotland. What I find difficult personally, speaking about poverty, is that I've never experienced real poverty. I've experienced hardship and massive debt, and at one point in my life had to go into a trustee. When I was a child, my parents went without so that my sister and I were provided for. I remember my dad at one point was doing 3 jobs. He was a toolmaker in NCR, played in a band at weekends and gave guitar lessons in the evenings to make ends meet. My mum got up at 5 AM and worked as a cleaner in Bell Street Tech. Life was hard, but I've personally never experienced the real hardship faced by some families across Scotland. I've been lucky to have always had a roof over my head, mostly good health, secure work and food in my belly, so I know I can count my blessings in life because I've never personally experienced poverty. However, I do know that's not the case for many people because I saw evidence of it every day in the faces of the children that I've taught. The ones that came to school with no coats in the winter and in the pouring rain. The ones who wore gym shoes because they couldn't afford proper shoes. Or the ones who did gym in their bare feet because they didn't even have gym shoes. The kids who had to depend on charities like Caring for Kids for the one and only Christmas present because parents couldn't afford Christmas. The kids who got themselves up and came to school with empty bellies because their parents were strung out on drugs or alcohol and there was no money for cornflakes. Yes, councils provide breakfast clubs, but they charge for them because they resent the facility being used as free childminding service. We in the Alba Party believe that school meals should be free for all school children without question of entitlement criteria and no stigma attached to receiving them. I would add, made fresh from good local sources on the premises and not what Dundee City Council do now, which is make them in a central facility to freeze and then they're defrosted at a later date in schools. Bet you didn't know that. School uniform banks and food banks are sadly a necessity for some people, but they're a sticking plaster on what's the biggest problem in Scottish society. Every Dundee school has a trolley at the door with food for folk to take without judgment because food banks have been commandeered as part of the social security system and folk who go to food banks can only go a certain amount of times. Most Dundee schools now have school uniform banks where folk can just take discarded or outgrown clothing without fear of judgment. Something is far wrong in a society where we have more food and clothing banks than actual banks. It's no wonder that people turn to drink or drugs because of the hopelessness of their situation, and this is just another scourge on our society. Children come from broken homes and along with it are having to cope with screaming matches, people at the end of their tether lashing out, and it's no wonder that families split up and end up living in homeless hostels. I know of children who wandered the streets at night because they didn't want to go home to domestic violence and abuse. I remember being told of one of my pupils in the Hilltown area knocking on a friend of mine's door at 9:30 at night to ask if he could use the toilet because nobody was at home in his own house. He was 8 years old. Goodness knows what would have happened to him if he'd knocked on the wrong door. I look back at class photos of some of these children and wonder what sort of lives they're leading now. I hope they've made a success of their lives and are not trapped in the endless, vicious cycle of poverty. And at the end of having to cope with the trauma of living like this, teachers expect children to settle into the school day, and actually learn. I know of teachers in every school in Dundee, because I've taught in a lot of them, who provide breakfast bars and fruit out of their own pocket so that any child coming to school late and hungry can have something to eat. And that is a common occurrence. Charities like Dundee Bairns provide free breakfast and lunches during the school holidays for kids who would otherwise go without. What a sad indictment of our society that thousands of our Scottish families, most of whom who are actually in work, have to rely on charity. Something is far wrong when both parents have jobs and yet still have to rely on charity to survive. It's a vicious circle and it goes on and on. Education is one of the key steps out of the cycle of poverty, but not enough money is allocated by governments and councils alike. This is one of the policies the SNP were asked to be judged on. Well, in my book, they failed big time. The average amount spent per capita is a few pounds per child per year. If we really value education, the Scottish Government really needs to put their money where their mouth is and invest in our children. Folk have lost hope, don't believe in politicians and their broken promises, but these are the folk who have most to gain from a Scotland governed by ordinary, competent people in an independent Scotland. Not the career politicians with a degree in politics from university, but ordinary people who have real life experiences of what life is all about and what matters, and a will to make things better in this country, better for everyone. The folk who don't bother to vote because they see their lives as hopeless and that nothing will change are the folk who have most to gain from voting. Why do you think the Tory governments are trying to make things harder for ordinary people by making it compulsory to have photo ID in order to vote? They're doing it because they know that if ordinary people knew about the power they actually possess and took that power, that real change is a political choice. And people in poverty have to shift that dial by getting out to vote for a change in priorities. It's imperative that people are registered to vote and get out to vote to make the real changes that we need in Scotland. The changes we can only make when we are not controlled by a government in another country who tell us what we can or can't do with our own money and resources. Ordinary people have the power to make the changes we need. It's up to us to get out and vote and make those changes happen. And after that rant,